All right, so this tutorial is going to cover how to use Alpha Channel for the purposes of the exercise, a little bit on masks. Essentially both of those are different kinds of masks. Layer blending, so you can bring in multiple layers from SketchUp, and other pieces of imagery. I'll show some other imagery. So that'll be covered here. So first is how to use Alpha Channel. So one of the things that I'm asking in the exercise is to create a line drawing, and this is a line drawing that I created as another layer of a project, and the overall layout is similar to what I'm asking you all to work on. And so I just wanted to concentrate on this perspective line drawing, and really I had a 3D model. I printed it out, I traced it, same steps that you're expected to work through. Just wanted to concentrate on this scrim, which is kind of like a screen that's just beyond the envelope of this building. But I don't necessarily want all of this trace paper, because this is a solid, and actually if it would come in as a JPEG or however you scanned it, whatever file, it's going to be actually flattened. So it's going to be like this background. And this Alpha Channel workflow will work in either case. So I just want to get the nuance of kind of the grayscale, the gradient here from a little bit darker to a little bit lighter, but I don't want the lighter overall trace paper as part of this. Just double click on the hand. Okay, so the first step is to, I'm just going to copy everything. So I hit M for my marquee tool, select a big window, and I'm going to Control C for copy. I believe that's Command C for Mac. So now it's copied to the clipboard. And I'm going to go here, make sure you have channels available. You can check them here in your window. I'm going to go here and I'm going to add channel. It's going to add an alpha channel, alpha 1. And then I'm going to Control V to paste what I had just copied. And I can deselect it, Control D to deselect. Now right here what I want to do, you can either invert it now or invert it later. I'm going to go ahead and invert it now. So I want to take and create an inversion, so basically the invert of what I want to keep. Anything that is black will be blocked out. Anything that is white, in this case, is going to allow that imagery to come through. And this kind of selection process, again, allows for a pretty good degree of detail and gradient. A lot different if you just used your eyedropper tool or what have you to make a selection, or the magic wand rather. So I am going to go ahead and go into Image, Adjustment, and Invert. I could just hit Control I as a shortcut. So now I have that inversion. I have a little bit of sloppiness in my scanning here, so I want to get rid of that border. I'm just going to hit my marquee tool, M. I'm going to drag a window there. Hold my Shift key down, and I can make multiple selections or add to the selection. I will do that. And I want to get rid of that. I do not want that to come through, so I will right-click, Fill, and I want it to be black. And Control D for deselect. So that's the selection I want. Now everything that is white is going to come through, and you can see there's a good amount of detail, even some of the smudging of the graphite. I want that texture, in this case, as part of the overall drawing. So I'm going to go back to layers now, and I'm going to create a new layer. And I can turn off the background layer here. I'm going to go into Select and down to Load Selection. And in this dialog box, I want the specific alpha channel. I'm not going to invert it. This is where you could invert it after, but I already did that. If not, you could just check that, and I'll say OK. Now I just have the selection from that channel coming through. There's nothing inside of it right now, so it's just the crawling ants selection. There's nothing in there right now, so I have to fill that. So I'll go to Edit, Fill, and I want to fill it in. In this case, this isn't about the masking. This is the color I want the selection to be. In this case, I'll go ahead and select Allow Black to be there. So I just filled it in based on the gradient of everything from that original image. Control D to deselect. And see, I have transparency, so I just have the line work now, and got rid of all that trace paper. There's a little bit of that hazing, but again, that's okay for the purposes of what I'm looking for here. So this is what it was. That's the original. You can see that detail again with the yellow background, and this is what it is now. So the advantage of that is that I could use this now as a layer over other modeled images. This is at the same perspective as other images that I exported. I was using Rhino in this case, but I had set up the viewport, so I can layer this together. When you bring it in, you may have to scale it a little bit. That's easily enough to do. So that's a layer among all the others here. Here there's a combination of, in Rhino I was using Flamingo. In this class we'll be using Podium with SketchUp. The ones I have highlighted here are actually the graphite scrim alpha channel that I brought in. So if I turn those off, all that was in the model was just this surface. And because of the layer blending, that surface now is kind of translucent and it's affecting layers below. There's also another pencil layer that's here. That's it. It's one of them. Multiple layers that I did, and I gave that kind of a sepia tone instead of the black graphite. So that's how I used it. I also then used layer blending to create that. So if I turn that first one off, you can see it's just the black line. If I highlight this layer, this one's at 100% opacity. So that's fine. This is the layer that I actually wanted to blend into all the others and through that one. So if I highlight this, you can see that there are different options, and I also gave it some transparency here. I dropped it to 55. So its divide is the one that I selected, but if you pull this down, that's what it looks like in normal. And I'm just going to use my arrow key because that's highlighted, and I can flip through all these layer blending options. So it's changing subtly. So one layer over the other, a little bit darker. A little bit more apparent if I turn up the opacity. So over here at difference. And finally, I landed on divide to kind of brighten it up. I wanted it to appear to be a bit more translucent, but that was a little stark for me, so that's why I dialed it down with the transparency to that 55 mark to allow for a little bit of depth, a little bit of haze, still have some detail there, and it enhances the overall image. So that's a little bit on layer blending. I'll show another example in just a bit. And that's what then I brought into this overall 11 by 17 format, again a similar format that you're all going to be working with. And that's where I brought in other textures, bits of information. This is a project in a harbor district, just a hypothetical project. You can see when I was working with the sky, very much inspired by the Labius Woods example that I showed, and very much about ideas, right? It's not necessarily about getting photorealism with this, but it's about expressing ideas and where they might be coming from. And so there's bits of periodicals, articles that are kind of part of this, the texturing that are in perspective with everything here, images of the context that I used, aerial photographs. There's some aerial photographs that are in here. There's a panorama at the bottom that you can perhaps pick up. And so it's fairly heavily layered here with just what I was thinking about, right? Ideas about the project, ideas why this is an important place, texture. This is one of the bridges that are there. It's a swing bridge adjacent to Kinnikinnick. And so that's really, and then the sky, of course, but that's really what how this all came together. So if you're working with something like this, again, your images are probably going to look a bit more like this from the get-go. There are some bits of depth that you can get, but you can hopefully, with this as an example, kind of see where things are going. That this is part of what we're working on. There's some rendering going on. Of course, there's rendering going on here. And as we get deeper and more refined with the rendering technique and layering it with other textures, you all will be adding information about textures on surfaces and so forth. Again, sometimes it's just easier to draw it than try to model it, and also just can give the drawing a bit more depth and not so stark as we're kind of seeing here. These are straight out of SketchUp. So they're not rendered through Podium or anything. But that's where this texture kind of came through. It's just some bottles that are there. Where we're headed, well, maybe before that, I will show you a bit about the masking. And so I have a couple masks that are set up here. And if I hit Control, it's going to give me the selection for that mask. And so this is the mask for this trace that's here, one of the layers of trace, the layer of trace that's over the bottles, and the bottles are showing through. And how I created that, and I'm just going to delete layer mask. Actually deleted everything. So Control Z. I'm going to, and it's the same rules that apply here that did with the alpha. So everything that's white will allow the imagery to come through. Everything that's black is going to say it's off. No imagery is coming through. So I'm just going to fill this all with white. When you bring your image in, of course, it won't have a mask on it, but I'm just kind of walking back just a little bit. And that's not working. It's because it's there. It was the layer blending that was on. Okay, deselect. Okay, so I want to give it a little bit of transparency just so I can see below, and I was just trying to have that texture over where these bottles were. The layers, their order is important, and so as you're looking at the layers are on top, of course they're on top of the other images. So I'm going to go ahead and delete that layer mask. So now it's a smart object, right? So I can double click on this and edit it separate from everything else. It's more handy, not necessarily for texture, but for perhaps the imagery and so forth. But I can still add a mask to it. So right now I have nothing selected, but I want to work with a mask. I have the layer selected. I'll go down to the bottom here and click the Add Layer Mask tool. So now everything is white, everything is still coming through. And I'm going to use my lasso tool, the polygon lasso tool. And I want to just select the area that I want to remove in this case, since it's all white right now. Since it's behind this image, it doesn't matter that it's there. And I will, this is open, it's a PNG, so it does come through a little bit. So I'm going to go ahead and just block that out. So all of this selection now I can right click, fill. I'm going to fill it with black because I want it to basically turn off that part of the image. It doesn't affect the image at all, so it's just a mask over that image. I could say, okay, deselect, and now I only have that image, or the texture in this case, that trace paper texture, over the area that I wanted. Everywhere else is open, and I could keep modifying this. If I hit Control and click that mask, it's going to give me that selection, so I can see where it's selected. I'm going to deselect. If I use my paintbrush tool or something like that, and I have white selected, it's going to allow that image to come through. And this is a funky brush that I have, but I could start like brushing areas that I want to have that texture come through and get pretty detailed and nuanced with how I'm just using my Alt key and then right click back and forth to change the size of the brush as opposed to going up here. So I could just keep adding subtle layers to it if some of that kind of comes through. If I wanted to add some here, I could do that. It's pretty subtle at this point. If I want to go ahead and add it anywhere else, I could do that. So I can use a brush tool to basically paint with the texture or whatever the image is using the mask. And it's creating, you can see a little area right there. Again, if I hit Control and click that, it's showing me everything that I just did to create that. I can deselect. As you're working, if you work with a lot of masks, it tends to create large Photoshop files. So at some point when that happens, you know you're not going to be changing it at all. You want to be able to go ahead and apply the mask. So here, apply layer mask. Oh, it won't let me do it, I believe because it's a smart object. If I rasterize this. Rasterizing means just turning that into pixels now. I should be able to apply the layer mask. So now it's just there. Now I can't go back and do that editing now. So you want to be sure that you're at the place where you want to with the masking and so forth. If not, you can always walk back. I just Control Z or walk back in your history. So I'll keep these open while I'm still kind of working with it. That's what I did to create this overall image. It was a lot of layers, a lot of nuance with using layer mask. You see a lot of them here for the sky, for all the aerial photograph that's kind of part of the texture of the image there. So that's how that was achieved. Also then through layer blending. So quick example here, this is how working with Podium, this is where we're headed kind of towards after we kind of set up the scene and everything, we kind of know a little bit more ideas about what the project is about. This is where we're headed. But to say I wanted to add, I don't know, some kind of graphic feature to this glazing, part of the glazing, this kind of clear story that's up there. And I could use, let's see, what should I use? And I think I have in my raw folder some other bottles. It's wine tasting, so I guess bottles. So I just dragged it in there. Automatically, it's going to assume that I want it to be a smart object. In this case, I dragged and dropped it. If I hold my Shift key down, I can maintain proportions. Once I hit Enter, see, then it turned it into a smart object. Again, I could rasterize that if I want it to be in the image, rasterize the layer, but I'll hold it out for now. I can still do what I need to in this case with it as a smart object. So I'm going to go into Edit and Transform. I'm going to go into Distort. So basically what I want to do is map it on that window wall, that clear story up here. I'm just following the perspective. Let me zoom in a little bit more. Following the perspective that's already set up in the image and using that as a guide. I could get a little bit more detailed with this, but for the purpose of this should be okay. So then I could hit Enter. Now if I still wanted to edit, because this is a smart object, if I still wanted to edit this somehow, I could double click on it. It's going to open it up as the original file. I can make my edits and save it, and then this will update. But I'm going to say I'm fine with this right now. I'm going to go ahead and invert it. So I'm Control I to invert that. I just want it to be a little bit more of a washed out kind of pattern on the glass. And I'm going to go through these various layer blending presets. So dissolve, and I'm using my arrow just to kind of click down, see which one makes sense. Grab something like that. Kind of going through all of them. And probably people do this in different ways. It's just kind of the workflow that I've used. A little bit more than that, because after I select it, I think I want like the white kind of washed out. Maybe soft light works. For now, I can always go back now and just soften it, just a really soft texture. That now is kind of a frick pattern on that glazing or printed graphic on the glazing. It could be kind of on a wall or what have you. It's just part of the texture of the space. And so instead of going in trying to figure out how to map this out in SketchUp or any other program, Rhino or otherwise, I could do a lot of things in Photoshop. I can see the perspective lines. I can start to follow that fairly easily and add some depth to the overall image. Right now in this image, the wine bottles are kind of dark back here. Eventually I want to get rid of this guy and add some other kind of entourage. You can see here the wine cooler. that set up this tall space that's kind of inserted with the stereoatomic mask. This needs a little bit of work in texture. It's just really flat right now. And so kind of just piece by piece, layer by layer, kind of working through how this overall scene is unfolding. And that just is helping me understand, to hopefully you all understand how to work with the software, and then of course use these as tools for design. The only other quick part I wanted to show everybody, and there's, this is just some of the preset styles in SketchUp, but also you can just get a lot of different kinds of information out of this. So edge style, if I turn off edges, I could just get, it's going to take just a sec, I could just get these other kind of tones, just like the shadows, the shade and shadows, and use that as a layer. If I wanted to do that, I could go into File, Export, 2D Graphic. I want to make sure that I'm using a PNG. I want to make sure that I'm using transparency for transparent background. Okay. Select the location that I want, save that, and then I'm just going to cancel this, and then use that as another layer. It's not one of the layers I've used yet, but I'm using it as a layer for setting up the image. Again, yours is going to look a little bit more like this, so a little, a little stiffer, but through the layer blending, through the masking, through using various techniques in Photoshop, we can start to deepen, start to soften, get an idea where this is headed in terms of design, and then allow that to be part of what we're looking for with the rendering, and then the overall kind of photo montage, or I would almost call this an esquisse in this case. And even I started to cut in using a mask a little bit here, so it lands on the white space a bit. So I'm trying to get it to sit on the sheet without being so stiff in a particular boundary. Okay, that'll do it for this one, and we'll take it from there. Thanks.